I'm gonna take you through all the steps, but while doing that, also describe what our startup went through throughout this journey and how we tackled each of these sections that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, again, as we mentioned last time, you have a journey for each product, right? So last time we were talking about idea and validation and so on. I'm pretty sure you've kind of moved forward from that since then. But just to kind of briefly describe the, let's say, product journey in general. So you always start from the idea. Last time I mentioned that it's always a good thing to prototype your idea, making sure it's a valid one before you step in and start development or start producing your product. It could be physical, it could be software, it could be anything. The next step, obviously, is the development. And usually in the development world, we call it the alpha version of your product, which is the very rough, usually very buggy, usually incomplete, and not ready for, let's call it shipment, right? So, and throughout this, I'm going to describe our journey with Spring Ring, which is our startup here. So the alpha version usually is what you develop in-house, right? So whether it's with your developers or with development company that you're working with. So you've developed something, you have a very rough product to start off with. The alpha version is usually tested internally, right? Amongst your team, amongst your users, internally within your company, or with people that you know on a personal basis, just testing out the product, seeing what bugs are discovered. Usually the bugs here are quite big. They cause the breaking of the product. And that's the cycle that you go through. Then obviously you move into what we call a beta stage. So beyond the alpha one, which is then the one highlighted here in gray, and this would be the closed beta version of your product, which is the first rough product that is now shippable to customers, right? So you're allowing customers to see it, to use it, to test it out, and so on. And throughout the presentation today, this is the phase that we're going to be talking about. Now, beyond that, of course, you move on your product to an open beta. Then beyond that, it's a product that you start commercializing, you start charging customers for, improving on, and so on and so forth. Now, don't forget that this whole process usually happens throughout the journey of your business, right? So as soon as you start introducing new features to your product, as soon as you start expanding on your product offering, usually you have to go through the same process as well. So a lot of you, for example, would be familiar with some of the features that, let's say, Instagram launches, right? So they don't launch it to the whole world straight away. What they do is they come up with an idea, they start testing it internally. Once they're ready with something that's testable, then they launch it to a small subset of users. And then based on the feedback they get, based on the testing results that they get, then they start opening it up to more users until they ship it to the whole world. So again, don't forget that this is not only a start of your product journey, this is also an iterative process. Every time you want to develop and build your product further, you go through the process that we're going to go through today. So again, going back to the purpose of our presentation today, which is the closed beta. Now, it's not clearly kind of segregated in terms of phases and so on, and people call them different things. It doesn't really matter as long as the principles are applied in general, right? So moving on now to exactly what does a closed beta testing entail. So as soon as you have your product ready to go to market, before you actually approach your customers or potential customers in this case, we always advise you to have a very clear idea about certain things before you actually embark on this, right? So first of all, you have to have a very clear idea about what your product is, right? So because as soon as you start talking to your customers, you have to describe it. Most of the time, it's something new. Most of the time, it's something that they haven't used before. Maybe even a different way of using things, especially for very, very innovative products. So that is the first one. You need to have a clear idea about what your product is, the description, what problem does it solve. So when you go to your clients, you have to have a very clear idea about these are the problems I'm trying to solve for you. Is the product new or revision? And this is what we talked about just moments ago. So because this process not only applies to newly developed products, but it also applies to a change in your product or an addition to your product. So that has to be also clearly defined here. Are you here introducing something completely new as a complete product, or are you only introducing certain features within your product? Or maybe a change. Sometimes it's a change. And I'll also give you examples of this and well, how we've gone through. Who are the competitors? As soon as you start talking to clients, they're going to compare you straight away to other people. So if someone comes up with, let's say, something that probably everyone here is used to, a competitor to Talabat, right? There are probably like 100 of them now in the market. So defining your competitor, usually for clients, it usually makes them more aware of what you're trying to achieve, right? Because they probably use your competitor's application or product or software, or if they haven't used it, then they know what it does. So again, that is also something. Then the next step is what is different about your product, right? So what is something that separates you and your product from your client's product? And this is something also that you need to define. Now, these are not always things that need to be communicated to your clients, but this is something that you need to define in general, right? So once you go through this, you have a clear idea about what your product is. Now, assuming, of course, everyone has done this usually before even starting any sort of testing. Now, then you go into more details, right? So what is your product experience? How will the user you start using it? Is it something they need to install? Is there any onboarding process that needs to happen before? Do they need to sign up to a certain thing or product? Do they need to invite their end users? And that's also something that needs to be clearly defined for the user. We always take the product experience or user experience as an afterthought, and that's a big mistake that a lot of products go through. How the user interacts with your product usually, and the first impression they get, a lot of the times is the last. They'll use it once, and if they're not forced to use it, then they'll just stop using it. So again, defining the experience, how does it usually work, and being clear about that is something that's very important here. Not only is the starting point important, but how is the user going to interact with it on a day-to-day basis, right? So you start off with, this is how you start using my product, but then how do you use it from the start and ongoing, let's say on a daily basis if it's a day-to-day product, or let's say on a need basis if needed. So again, the product experience definition is very important here. The last part that you need to define at this stage is usually your target market. And this is the most kind of important part here. And I touched upon this as well during the idea stage and the prototyping one. You have to clearly define who are your users. Now, some of you have mass products that can be used by everyone. So for example, if WhatsApp comes along, of course, for them, it's almost everyone that has a mobile phone can start using it. But then you have very specialized products. So if a product is a niche product that only targets a certain subset of people within a subset maybe of an industry, or does it target a certain region or country, for example, and all these things need to be defined. So again, defining maybe region, country, age groups. Is it something targeted for kids, or is it something targeted for adults? Again, that's something else you need to define. What are the technologies they need to use? Is it a web-based product or is it a mobile app? All these things need to be, again, defined here. And then eventually, of course, you can then start approaching or defining your, let's say, ideal clients in this case. So going back, and I said this, I'm going to take you through this with examples. So I'm just going to go up a couple of slides here. So let's speak about Spring Ring for a second, which is our startup. And as I had mentioned before, we just not finished, but pretty much kind of gone through the whole process here. So as a product, we first define it, what it is. It's a school communication management platform, okay? Solves the communication between users within the schools, teachers, parents, students, school administrators, and so on. Is the product new? Yes. We had just launched the product and we kind of introduced it to the market, or at that time, let's say, we didn't. So beginning of 2019, it was still just finished development internally. The competitors, of course, we defined the competitors. We have quite a few: Class Dojo, Remind, so on. And then we sat down, started comparing our product to these competitors' product, and then gone through, okay, these are the differences, so that when we approached our target clients, or in this case, our beta users, we could clearly define to them, these are the differences and these are the things you're going to get. The product experience. Now, with us, it was quite a journey in terms of product experience. Why? Because we provide this product to schools. So when we start defining the onboarding process, it's quite lengthy. So first, the school has to sign up as a school administrator. As soon as the school administrator signs up, they start adding all their users. The users will be invited, right? As soon as they receive the invitation, the parents will be able to download a mobile application and then sign in. Teachers will have both a web and a mobile application. And based on that, they'll be able to use the platform on both. Now, how then they interact with it on a daily basis? Teachers can start communicating with parents through posting. The administrator can remove, add users as they come in and go out, and so on and so forth. So we had a whole list of things that we needed to do to onboard the clients. And then there was the process of how do you use it on a daily basis, right? And we had actually written a user guide that we provided for the users and for each and every type of user. So as you can see, it was quite a kind of big product that we had to kind of tackle on multiple levels and multiple users. But this is where then our target market came in place. Who were we targeting in this particular situation? We are targeting schools, right? So we had to approach schools. Even when it comes to schools, are we targeting schools only in Bahrain? What type of schools? As you already know, we don't target universities. So those were not our target market. We were, though, targeting preschools, and we were targeting also more K-12 schools, as they call it, which are basically the bigger schools. But then we also went even further in defining which sector do we target. Are we targeting the public schools as well, or only the private ones? And then we came to kind of a conclusion: no, let's target only the private ones now, and then maybe tackle the public. And of course, then when it comes to which platforms, as I said, we had both mobile applications on iOS, Android, we have a web version. The teacher had a web version, the administrator had its own web version. So we defined the whole, what we call the ecosystem for the users. Now, as you can see, this is quite a process, but the more you define it upfront, the better you can tackle the testing period that we're going to talk about now. So once you've defined all that, you've prepared your product, you're ready to go to, not go to market, but go into the testing phase with actual clients, set your objectives, right? So what do you want to get out of this testing phase? What I called previously a closed beta phase, right? Why do we call it a closed beta? Because people cannot come and just ask you to use your product. You select your clients, and it's only closed to that group of clients or customers that you want to deal with. Now, the objectives here, when it comes to defining them, you have to be very clear about what you want to get out of this testing period, right? So for us, for example, and again, we defined our objectives in this way. What we wanted to get, of course, is user experience. We wanted to test the onboarding process. Was it easy for users to be invited and join? Was it easy for the administrator to go in and get all their users set up and so on? Is it actually working in terms of features? And I'll tell you now at the end how we changed quite a few things in our product based on this closed beta period that we went through, because we defined certain things in certain ways. When it was actually used by real clients and real users, they told us that no, this actually doesn't work. You need to come back with something else. Now, again, defining what you need in terms of feedback from your clients is something that's very important before you actually get them on board. Because setting the expectation for yourself then lets you kind of systematically gather that feedback and have a process for how to take some of the feedback and implement it, or maybe it's about that your product's just not clear. You need to maybe make it more clear to the clients and how they should use it. So just defining these objectives from the outset is usually very important. So then you have the more direct objectives, right? And these are things that need to be communicated to your test audience, right? So what do you want them to start doing? Do you want them to use the product completely? Or do you want them to only test a certain set of your product? And this comes to basically the difference between launching a new product or launching a feature. So if, let's say, I'm only launching a feature, I need to communicate to my test audience that the purpose of testing in this case is only this feature. And is this feature working for you or not? Whereas if you're launching a new product, which I'm guessing all of you are going through that now, is no, you're actually asking them to test the product completely. But it's always good to tell them, okay, well, these are the things that I need you to test, because it's a new product for the client. They don't know exactly what it does, maybe in a lot of cases, or how it works. So guiding them through this testing phase is actually quite good. Then, of course, you have everything else that needs to be done. Then the objectives are defined, you have everything in place, you know who you're targeting, you've chosen your customers. Then, of course, you start your testing, right? Then having your test details. This is something for you, right? Versioning is very important. So usually when we launch our very first closed beta, it's what we called here for Spring Ring, let's say, it was a 0.1 version, right? So usually the 1.0 is usually your actual product. It's tested, it's done, you're shipping it, maybe you're having some paying customers, but 0.1 is that. And then as you start iterating the updates, then you start upgrading the versions, but having this versioning, having the what we call a change log for what are the things that are going through. I'm trying my best to also not get too technical. I know a lot of you are have the technical background, but just in general, think of it as just versions of a document that you're working on. So you have the very rough draft in the beginning, then maybe you did some editing, maybe you gave it to someone to read and they've done some editing to that, and then you have another version until you're out with your, let's say, shippable book, so to speak. So again, just having the test details, what are you testing, knowing exactly the updates that you're going through, versioning of your product, and going through these steps is very important in this case as well. Lastly, of course, always set a timeline. And this is actually very important. A lot of people get this wrong because they're very excited about their product and they forget that you actually have to give it time to mature as a product. Others just go through a very long testing period, right? But testing periods differ between products. So, for example, with us, we actually went through almost a whole academic year of a closed beta. So it was almost from the beginning of 2019 all the way to the end of 2019 that we started working on a closed beta where we had schools on board, users using it, and so on, only because we had a very big also target audience. Schools have a lot of stakeholders, so to speak. So you have your teachers that you have to deal with, you have your parents, you have the school administrator, you have the different types of functionalities. So that also took quite a lot of time. But we went almost through a whole year of that. So the target release date is usually how do you want to move from your closed beta into a more kind of evolved version of your product. And throughout that time, you're going through iterations of updates, of sitting down with your clients, listening to them, getting their feedback, and so on. What is the cutoff date? So usually with clients, you have to set this up for them. So they will not come back to you and say, oh, well, this is my feedback. So you have to probably set certain time periods where you go back to your clients, get the feedback from them, and then start either redevelopment of certain aspects of your product or just go through an iteration of what you need to do, right? And then, of course, when is the last date when you're ready and you're ready to go. So this was basically, in general, what you need to do. The key stakeholders internally, and this is something that we had to do only because we had a bigger team, but what are, who's the product owner, who will be leading the technical side of things and getting the feedback and implementing it and fixing things, recruitment of customers. That's a very important part. And after you've identified who your customers are, getting the right customers. And again, I'll just touch upon one thing that we talked about before, which was, family and friends. Usually with testing, you can involve family and friends in an alpha phase of your product, of course. But then when you go into a beta phase, it's always better to use people or companies, if you're a B2B kind of also product, always use people that are outside your comfort zone. You tend to get more honest feedback on your product. You tend to get a lot more, let's say, scrutiny on it because they don't have a vested interest in you succeeding, of course. So again, I know sometimes usually it's difficult. The recruitment process, usually people leverage their own network. So if you have your own network, of course, it's easier to just tap into that, right? And I've done the same, by the way. So the first people or the first schools that we got on board were schools that I had a connection with, right? So both the schools that my kids went to we're the first schools to be in the beta phase of our product. Why? Because I have easy access to the school. I know the people there. I'm actually an end user. I know quite a few of the parents as well within the school. So it just makes it easier for me to gather the feedback and so on. So of course, you need to tap into your existing network, but try to kind of widen it out from your quote unquote family and friend circle. And that usually gives you better feedback. The last thing we really want to mention here, and I'll probably show you in the next slide, is the data. I am personally very data driven. I think everyone should at least have a certain sense of data when they want to measure things, because in let's say most cases, people might disagree with me, but I would say always numbers don't lie. So if your product is doing good, if it's being used and so on, the numbers will tell you, right? So and there are tons of analytics tools out there. Okay, whether you're launching a website, so you have Google Analytics, for example, that you need to plug in, or let's say you're using social media in general just to get something out and start testing it, then Facebook, Instagram, and all the rest have their own analytics tools. There are a lot of third-party analytics tools that you can capture. It all depends on your product, right? So, for example, with us, we use Firebase when it comes to testing out our mobile usage. So again, that's something that we kind of plugged into our product way before we even started testing it with real clients. So all in all, what happened was this, right? So this is just a clear example, again, only because I'm very particular about data here. You can see the line, which is January of 2020. This is when we took our product from being in a closed beta version, as you can see before, January 2020. We were in closed beta, and we had a very, very steady number of users, right? Those were the users that we had onboarded. We had 50 teachers, as you can see on the very far left of the presentation. We have 50 teachers. The students at that time were irrelevant because they weren't active users, but it was basically 400 students amongst the 3 schools that we had. 720 parents. Now, not all of them were active. Actually, the number of active parents during that period was around 400 parents. So we had 50 teachers, and those were a mix as well. So we call them educators here because it's a mix of school administrators and teachers. So we had that as testers, and 400 parents almost testing it almost on a daily basis while they were receiving messages from the school or from the teachers and so on. So as soon as we finished that, we set a very clear cutoff date that on January 2020 beginning, we're going to expand our client base. We're going to start marketing our product. We're going to start onboarding more schools. And as you can see, as soon as we start doing that, we onboard more schools, and pretty much, almost 12 times the number that we had in our initial phase, right? So we went from 400 to up to now where we have almost 6,300 users on board. And these are daily active users, right? So what I really wanted to kind of show you here is the very clear distinction between the 2 phases here. One phase is obviously your testing phase before, where you control everything. You control the number of users you have, you control the versioning of your product, you control how you release the features and what you need the users to tell you and what feedback you need from them. And you have to be very clear with the users in this case. Now, how we approached it from a business perspective is tell users you can start using this for free, right? So they have it, they can use it for free now. They test it out for you because obviously it's a trade. You're giving them a product that they can use, and you're getting the feedback in return, and they're helping you improve and build your product further. Once you're satisfied with that, then you go into that. Now, of course, the closed beta, we went through maybe 10 or 12 versions of changes during that period. So throughout the 2019, it was maybe 10 or 12. So almost every month we had a new release of either fixes or changes in our product based on user feedback. So we initially thought that a certain way was the best way to approach a problem, but then users came back to us saying, actually, this works better for us, and we would listen to them. Can we listen to everything? Of course not. Otherwise, each client will have their own version of the product. But again, getting that feedback and knowing how and what to implement is quite important. Now, that doesn't mean that during 2020 we didn't launch anything. During the period of the 6 or 7 months in 2020, what we did is every 3 months, we launch a new feature or product within our product. So we launched during this period the student application, and we needed to test that with clients. So we went through the same process again, but now you're not testing a full platform, let's call it, but you're testing a subset of features. So we would launch 3 or 4 features, tell our clients about them, get their feedback, and we go through the same process. So this process that we talked about today is something that never stops throughout your journey with your product, albeit, of course, on a smaller scale. So you will have to do iterations and changes on a smaller scale and with smaller kind of features as you go along. But this process stands kind of right for each feature that you want to launch. So all in all, this is something that you need to kind of keep doing as you go, right? So because just one last thing about the student app, when we launched it, it changed our target audience, of course, right? So now we had a new target audience, which are students. We had a mobile application, so we had them to interact with. The user experience for teachers and parents also changed because now the student is also part of the platform. So we had to also inform them. So even though this came in 2020 after the product actually matured and was out to market, we had to go through this whole process all over again when we launched the new mobile application for students. So this is in general user testing